Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Drew Bond, as I think you guys know. Anyway, I'm the founder and CEO of C3 Solutions. In case you don't know, C3 Solutions actually stands for the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. And so we started the organization back in 2020. John Hart and myself, John's now moved on to open the books, and he's quite busy with the work that Doge is doing these days. And anyway, we started with the premise because I've been in the energy and environment innovation space for a while. And for the longest time, conservatives, Republicans had run from the issue of climate, and frankly, to our peril. My perspective, our perspective is no matter what you think about the climate, the best solution is always based on free market competition with more energy that's more abundant, that's more affordable, and more reliable over time, and that is clean as possible. And so when we started the organization, one of the first things we did was, I think maybe through a conversation with Nick Loris. Where's Nick? There's Nick. Nick Loris and Mike Frank. Mike's in the back there. Mike's on our advisory board and policy director over at the budget committee now. But we were talking through our prior experience, having been at the Heritage Foundation, and thought, I really love the way that the Index of Economic Freedom communicates how countries should really strive to help their people rise out of poverty and do it based on some key fundamental principles. And principles like rule of law, which means no corruption in government, or minimal corruption in government, abiding by the law, but also lower taxes, lower regulations, making sure that the regulations actually do what they're supposed to do and they don't create unintended consequences. And so we talked about, I wonder if you took the data from the Index of Economic Freedom and correlated it with some environmental index, what would you find? And so Nick said, why don't we look at the Yale University's Environmental Performance Index? That's one of the best. And so we put the data together, and of course, what do you find? You find that free economies are clean economies, and thus the title of our report. And it turns out they're not just a little bit freer. Free economies are twice as clean as unfree economies. And this, if you think about it, is really intuitive. If you look at history, you look at East and West Germany, which one had better air quality? If you look at North and South Korea, which one has better environmental quality? If you look at some of the more modern economies and countries today, the United States and countries in the EU, and then look at countries like Iran, look at countries like Russia, look at countries like China, who has a better environmental footprint. And so this is really a fundamental message as a part of our organization, and I think ideally would be a fundamental message in terms of the policy initiatives as we think about doing what's best for the planet, making sure that it's first and foremost what's best for people. And so anyway, I want to really thank you for being here. It's my honor to have each of you here. I see many friends from years ago and many longtime friends. Especially I've already recognized Nick, but especially thank him for writing this report. We've written it now 4 years, and we're very proud of it. I also want to thank Michael Bruce. Where are you, Michael? Michael's on our board. Michael and I work together at the Department of Energy, and so Michael's been a friend and a journeyman through many years. And I mentioned Mike Frank on our advisory board and longtime friend from years ago at Heritage, and now he's doing the very tough work over at the budget committee. And then I want to also call out especially Diana from the Heritage Foundation. And so we're excited that you're going to be joining us on a panel discussion today. Heritage has really just been critical in terms of its many years of pushing this message forward. The Index of Economic Freedom is now, I say almost 30 years. I don't know, it's probably 27, 28, but I round up. But it's been a very long-standing report that's been really important in helping create a race among countries to rise to the top. And so literally that report, as a result of it, you will have countries from around the world come and try to lobby Heritage on why they should be higher on the rankings. And I will say that Heritage does a very good job of ensuring that the data is the data and it speaks for itself. But it just shows you the impact of that report and creating a race to the top. And I think that's what we want to do here with our Free Economies report, is we want to create a race to the top of the environment, with people understanding that, again, it's bottom up, it's competition, it's more innovations, more energy. That's what people in the environment need the most. So with that, let me just say a few more words and then we'll go into the panel. The report, I'm proud to say that we've had some really notable authors write the foreword. The first year, I don't think we actually had a foreword for it, but we had a release event at Glasgow at the COP, and Liam Fox was actually our keynote speaker and wrote an op-ed for the report. Liam is a longtime member of Parliament, was a speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher, and so someone that obviously cares a lot about economic freedom. The next year it was Ed Fulmer, the longtime president and founder of the Heritage Foundation. And there again, it felt like a nice feather in our cap that we were able to get someone who's such a really just a longtime leader of the conservative movement, put his name on something that, while the report really focuses on broadly the environment, our name clearly has climate in our name. And so Ed was willing to do that because he understood the importance of this message and what it means to the world. The next year, the foreword was written by someone named Chris Wright. It just turns out that Chris is now the Secretary of Energy. And so Nick would like to think that we're smart enough to make that happen. Maybe we're a little lucky, but Chris is a friend, and it was perfect timing. And I know when several people reached out to me, asking who do I think is going to be the next Secretary of Energy, I said, well, I don't think it's going to be anyone that's being mentioned right now in the media. It's probably going to be a governor, frankly. But I then said, there's just one guy named Chris Wright who would be great. He's a scientist, he's an engineer, he's a businessman, he understands the dynamics of energy. And this person who I was having this conversation with kind of laughed and said, well, it's funny you say that because we know that a letter's been delivered to the president and recommending that Chris be the next Secretary of Energy. So I guess great minds think alike, but I didn't influence that process, but we're grateful that Chris is where he is. And so this year, as you know, Jody Arrington wrote the foreword for this. And so I'm excited that he's going to be joining us after the panel. Jody's been a longtime friend, and when you read the foreword of the report, you'll see again that, here is a conservative member of Congress from a very conservative state. Texas is really emblematic of being all the above and below for the longest time in terms of energy. And also having very competitive electricity markets, also creating an environment where competition can thrive, and so I was born in Texas. I'm not gonna be here to say that I am a fully born and bred Texan. I was born in Texas and bred there in Oklahoma. But so for my Texas friends, this is not just a Texas story. The story is what's happening in Texas, and what has happened in Texas around the energy markets is we think one of the best examples for what not only other states should do, but what other countries should do. And so anyway, with that, I just want to say a few last things. It's interesting. So Jody, is on the Freedom Caucus, and then he and I actually met a while back, one point in the basement of this building over dinner, and he was asking what I was doing, and what is this crazy conservative organization that you guys have started, focused on the climate. And we started whiteboarding on a napkin, as you do when you have a good startup. And I remember talking about this report and how important this message is, and the message that the world needs to hear, particularly younger generations, because the message prior is climate change is the #1 issue. The alarmism, it was really driving top-down policy choices that we've seen now play out that are very dangerous in places like Germany, and so it's critical that not only we get the policy right and recognize that not all climate policy is good climate policy, that we need to think through these policies and recognize that we need more innovation, right? We need more innovation across the board. But also recognizing that future generations, younger people, many of you in this room, for the longest time, what you've heard is, the sky is falling because of climate, therefore the government needs to step in and fix it. And we know that that is not the right approach, and actually has very negative unintended consequences. So Jody and I were talking about this, and I just said we need to take this issue back. At minimum, we need a competition of ideas so that the best policies will win, and that free economies really creates an on-ramp for conservatives and Republicans, libertarians, anybody, frankly, to join in the climate conversation in a way that's consistent with their values, whether you care the most about the environment or you care more about people living in poverty and helping them to rise out of that, whether you care more about taxes or whether you care more about reducing regulations. Take your pick. There's multiple reasons to on-ramp into this conversation, and so anyway, I hope you'll read the report. I hope you'll talk about the report. I hope you'll promote the report. I do really think it is foundational, and I'm grateful that all of you would be here for this. So with that, I do want to now turn the panel over to the mic and invite them up, and we're going to have Ian Banks moderate a good dialogue, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. I'd love to welcome the panel right now. Nope, please, forever. Thank you very much for that introduction, Drew, and setting the context for this report and the work of C3. I'm C3's newest hire. I joined the team about 9 weeks ago, so this is, I was familiar with the organization, really excited to get to join in the unique and really important work that C3 is doing. There's a lot of allied organizations, but I think C3 policy work that C3 does is unparalleled. The sort of conservative, the conservative heart at C3 is what drives us, and that's something that I'm very excited about. So very excited about this panel and about the release of this report. It is an important moment for the organization. It's a really important moment for energy policy. And so this is thinking about how to make an economy freer and cleaner at the same time is, I would say, the most important issue facing our country right now. We want to unleash energy dominance. We are very, very excited about energy dominance. But how do we do that in a way that supports the environment, in a way that supports our conservative principles, and how do we do that in a way that supports every single American and every single person around the world? And so that's what we'll be talking about this morning. So we have today Nick Loris. He is the Executive Vice President at C3, focusing on policy work. Diana Roth, who is the Director of, make sure I get your title right. It is the Director of the Center for Energy, Climate, and the Environment, and the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Chris Barnard, the President of the American Conservation Coalition, a very close friend of C3, and then Emily Dominic, who's the Senior Vice President at Boundaries Known Partners. I'd love for each of you all just to go through, give 2 sentences about how you see free economies as clean economies. Start with you.
Yeah, I can start. As the author of the report for the last 4 years, what drew me to writing this report was the principles that undergird economic freedom and how they apply to both economic well-being, but also protecting the environment. As Drew mentioned, a strong rule of law, strong private property rights, more competition that leads to more innovation, regulatory efficiency, lower taxes. All of those things are so critical to human well-being and prosperity, and that gives people the resources to protect and care for the environment. If it's not just this strong correlation between economic freedom, economic progress, and environmental progress. It's also through better healthcare. It's also through more innovation. And so you see all of these strong correlations between economic freedom and human prosperity, including the environment. And part of that is because freer economies are also wealthier economies. And so, one of the fundamental aspects of this report since its inception is this notion of this environmental Kuznets curve, that you get wealthy, you have the resources to care about the environment, you have the means to actually do something about it. And so when we think about the actual application of this report, it is diving deep into those policy principles, and it's really how we evaluate regulation, is how we evaluate legislation. Do we think it is going to increase economic freedom or decrease economic freedom? Is it going to be good for people or bad for people? Is it going to be good for the environment or bad for the environment? And all of these things have trade-offs. It's not an easy yes or no answer, but it does provide that first lens of how we evaluate public policy.
Well, I want to congratulate C3 and particularly Nick on this wonderful report. It is so thought-provoking, just looking at all the graphs, looking at all the data in it, and I want to congratulate all of you for this great effort. In terms of economic freedom and the environment, I think we can just look internationally about where people want to be. Look at migration patterns. People are migrating from Africa to Europe in search of more economic freedom, more dense energy, in fact, more fossil fuel use, because that's what creates jobs and prosperity. People are migrating from Latin America, South America to the United States and Canada because we have more dense energy, and this creates prosperity, jobs, opportunity. That's what people want. Within the United States, as my colleague Mario Loyola has shown in a paper, Mario is standing in the back, about energy costs in different states. People are leaving states such as New York, California, states that have mandates for renewables, and going to areas where there are no mandates for renewables, and more jobs, more manufacturing, more opportunities. So I think we can see what people want. And the movie has changed. The movie used to be an inconvenient truth. Now the movie is China syndrome. We're looking at what we can produce here and being independent from China. Renewables have cost us, in terms of tax subsidies, they've cost us $10 trillion globally over the past 20 years. We need to be moving into an area where people use more of their natural resources. In the United States, that means more oil and natural gas. This is going to have vast geopolitical implications by detaching the world from China and enabling us to be energy independent.
Just to echo Diana, congratulations on the fourth installation of a great report, and we've really enjoyed our partnership with C3, and so just wanted to make sure I emphasize that. I came to this issue primarily out of confusion. I was a young person who, like many other young people my age, just loved the outdoors. I loved skiing, I loved hiking, I loved camping, and I always grew up as someone who had this deep passion for nature and protecting it. At the same time, I also really loved politics. For as long as I can remember, I just wanted to learn everything I could about it. I considered myself to be a conservative. That was a worldview I developed for myself. But it felt like those two things were in tension, right? Like you mentioned an inconvenient truth. I was born in 1998. My entire life on this issue has been Al Gore in the early 2000s through AOC today. And it never felt like there was a counterbalance. It never felt like there was a counter narrative being offered to people my age. Up until organizations like C3 were founded, the American Conservation Coalition that I now run. And so I just was trying to figure out what it means to be a conservative who also cares about the environment and to be a responsible steward while also wanting to have a prosperous economy for everyone. Everything I was told in school, everything I was taught by my professors was along the lines of an inconvenient truth. It was that actually capitalism is destroying the planet. A few years ago, there was a poll in America that showed that young people under 30 had a more favorable view of socialism than of capitalism. One of the root causes of that, I believe, is because of how much they care about the outdoors and the environment. For so long, we've told them that you can't have both. You can't have, on the one hand, a prosperous economy, and on the other hand, a well-protected environment. And I think this report is just such a great counter-narrative to that. The data and the graphs are just so compelling with the Kuznets curve and other data points that show that actually economic growth is what allows you to have greater environmental protection. That's a narrative that I think pierces through the pessimism and catastrophism of the other side. It still says we can protect the environment. That is why we're here. We want to protect the natural world around us. It's something we've inherited. As conservatives, it's something we need to pass on to future generations. But the way that we do that is through innovation, competition, and entrepreneurship, not through degrowth.
I think you do, but I think it's because of my message. So I love that we got told to do 2 sentences and all of us couldn't help but talk for 5 minutes. Yeah, it's okay, it's okay. I'll keep it brief, but I'll say I love that you led this report with the Milton Friedman quote about how, free markets give people choices, not the choices that other people think they ought to make. I think far too often in the context of the environment, we have let the powers that be and the technocrats and the federal government say, these are the choices that you must make in order to be a good citizen and care about the environment. And functionally, that's not true. We know oftentimes that people want to, much like Chris tells his story about caring about the environment and caring about the outdoors and having that be something that brought him to the environmental movement, most people feel that way. And most people are told over and over and over again by the powers that be that if you don't pay more for your electricity or you don't support these top-down policies that require certain types of energy to be used in the United States or elsewhere, that you don't care. And that's simply not true. We see it over and over again. We hear it from our farmers, we hear it from regular people in America, and we hear it from people around the world who are simply looking for opportunity to prosper and be able to take care and cultivate the resources that they have. So I love that focus in this report, and I love thinking about the environment as something that we have the ability to take care of if we have a prosperous and free world. You don't have the luxury of caring about the environment if you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from. And that's something that we have to think of when we think about these policies, particularly when they are applied on the developing world, who we often leave in the dust when we say, hey, you have to meet this new standard, or you can't, you got to pay to play. And I think I really love seeing that tied throughout this report. I love seeing my colleagues here on this panel who have talked about it for years and years, and that focus on how do we provide more freedom and opportunity, because that leads to the outcomes we want, not using the outcome to create a new framework for the discussion.
Thank you all so much. Emily, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned choices, and right now the president has clarified that there's energy dominance is the agenda. Congress has a whole lot of priorities that they want to get through in the next few months. You've served as an advisor for multiple speakers of the House. Tell us about some of the choices that Congress faces right now and how Congress can best prioritize energy and the environment at the same time.
So I think you're seeing obviously we're having a big discussion about the tax agenda because that's really driving the story. We have the Trump era TCJA tax cuts that are expiring at the end of this year. So there's a little bit of a clock to move on that stuff. It's taking the forefront, I think, of the reconciliation discussion. But you're seeing the kind of work, like sort of rank and file work that you need to see on our committees happening at the same time. And I would caution folks to not just get completely caught up in the tax discussion and fall into this trap that like tax policy is energy policy 100% of the time. There was a great article in Politico yesterday about Bruce Westerman, who is one of my favorite members of Congress, who I will talk about all the time, and how he's really focused on continuing to do the kind of bipartisan permitting reform work that we saw in the Fix Our Forest Act, which was one of the first bills passed through this Congress, and sort of looking ahead to the longer agenda on how do we do broader permitting reform outside of the reconciliation process. So I would think of it very much as all of these tracks can exist at the same time, and there's no reason that we need to say Congress can only do reconciliation, or the Trump administration can only take the executive action that they're taking, which is phenomenal, frankly, to speed up the process to get more infrastructure and energy built here in this country. We need to do all three of these tracks. We need the regular order track, we need the reconciliation track, and we need the administration to take those executive actions in a quick and forceful way. And I think we're seeing that play out in our committees. We've seen permitting reform hearings held in EPW. We're seeing them in natural resources. We're seeing great hearings come out of energy and commerce with a new chairman who's really taking a focus on this sort of energy abundance agenda and how do we actually do that within our jurisdiction. And I think it's also part of our reconciliation discussion too, is how much can we do in the context of spending that allows us to move things forward in that partisan way. So I think truthfully you're seeing it on all fronts, and we'll continue to see that throughout this year.
Yeah, if I could just add to that real quick, looking at what Congress has done already, even just through the introduction of bills, we talk about permitting reform a lot. It almost got across the aisle during the last Congress and the last administration. It didn't. But a lot of that focused on reforming the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is very critical to permitting reform. But you've already seen this Congress take up a number of other issues that are really important for regulatory modernization to allow us to build more to protect the environment. Emily mentioned Congressman Westerman also released a great thorough bill on Endangered Species Act reform, which is critical to this. We've seen critical minerals bills introduced already. So, this colloquial all of the above really does apply to both energy abundance, energy affordability, and reliability, but also to modernizing these outdated regulations to comport with an economy in 2025.
Just to quickly add to that, one of the fun parts of my job is I get to speak on a lot of college campuses. And it's actually kind of amazing how little the people that say they care about this know about it. And I'll ask them questions like, okay, what is the number one source of clean electricity in America? And they'll be like, wind or solar. It's like, no, it's actually nuclear energy. One of the things that's holding back nuclear energy is we have an outdated regulatory system that makes it extremely difficult to build new nuclear in this country. I'll ask them, what's the number one obstacle to building more clean energy, from transmission lines to geothermal to wind and solar? What's the number one obstacle to that? And they say, oh, it's big oil or something like that. What's actually our permitting system, right? On average, it takes nearly 5 years extra to go through this permitting system to build a project. By that time, it's uneconomical and it doesn't make sense anymore. And China's putting up 3 of them in 1 week, right? So we need to start modernizing our permitting processes. I'll ask them, oh, California, heralded as the leader on climate policy at the state level in this country, what's happening with the wildfires there? How's that impacting their ability to do some of this stuff? And it's well, actually, the 2021 wildfire season emitted more emissions than the last 10 years of emissions reductions combined. And so the very people that are saying they care about this are also the very ones that are opposing the solutions that will actually do something about that. I think we need to reframe it in the way that young people can understand, and then actually work on policies and solutions that can make progress, but also continue telling them that we're doing this because we actually care, not because we just want to get rid of environmental regulations for the sake of it.
All right. I teach at George Washington University, and I have to say that young people are very, very sympathetic when you explain it. So when I say 3 billion people around the world don't have electricity and running water, and the only way to get there is more fossil fuel use, they understand that. They don't want to go without hot showers. They don't want to go without charging their phones. They can't imagine a situation where they would have to walk 3 miles a day to have clean water to bring it back to their homes. And when you explain it to them and you show them that people are moving from these fossil fuel poor areas to fossil fuel rich areas, they totally get it. It's just no one's told them that before.
You mentioned nuclear, Chris, and Nick, you just wrote a paper on China as that China is not a clean energy darling. China has this image of being very green, very clean. They are not that. But they are building a lot of nuclear. There are 61, according to the World Nuclear Report, there are 61 nuclear reactors being built in the world. 29 of those are by China, and 25 of those are by Russia. There are 0 being built by the US. Let's talk a little bit about that right now. Why are these kind of petro-states building many nuclear reactors when we are building 0?
Yeah, I'm sure we all have a lot to say about that. And the amount that China is building, I think in the last decade is the same amount that we've built in the last 4 decades. So it's really incredible statistics. And they've just kind of, through their central planning process, they've just been able to kind of drive the process and build as quickly as possible, where our processes through the nuclear regulatory commissions, the licensing and permitting process is very arduous and again does not reflect all of the innovative technologies that are being developed by American technologies, by Japanese, Korean technologies. There are so many of our friends and allies who are interested in building more SMRs, including American-led innovators. Yet we have this process that is very slow, where companies have been rejected by the NRC, and so yes, the NRC is trying to change that through its new Part 53 regulation, but it's taking entirely too long. We saw the ADVANCE Act pass last year. That made some process to trying to provide more efficiencies to the process, and it had overwhelming support in both the House and the Senate. But I think that's just really scratching the surface of what needs to happen for regulatory reform, both at the NRC, but we also need to think about how we manage spent fuel. That process is broken. I mean, we were supposed to have the federal government collect the spent fuel as part of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and they haven't. All of the nuclear companies sued the federal government for failing to fulfill their statutory obligation, and they won. And now who's paying for it? We all are, the taxpayers, through the general fund. And so all of these processes, from the front end to the operations to the back end of nuclear, really need to be fixed to give SMRs and innovative technologies a chance to compete in the marketplace. We shouldn't build nuclear for the sake of building nuclear. If it's too expensive, so be it. But I truly think that nuclear can be competitive with natural gas, with renewables and storage, if we allow it to do so through fixing these regulations.
Well, nuclear power, we used to build nuclear power plants much faster. My colleague Jack Spencer has just written a book, Nuclear Revolution. I highly recommend it. Anyway, he points out that years ago we built a nuclear power plant in 2 years. Now it maybe takes 10 to 15 because of the new regulatory environment. But as to why China and Russia are building these nuclear power plants, they are getting pressure from their population for cleaner air. Just as we want cleaner air here, they want cleaner air. When the American embassy in Beijing started putting some measuring device on the roof, measuring the number of particulates in the air in Beijing, and then putting this on the internet, there was big pushback in Beijing because they wanted cleaner air too. And so even though using coal is probably less expensive in China and oil is less expensive in Russia, they are building these nuclear power plants because they also want cleaner air. And the fact is that Europe and the United States are deindustrializing because of the regulations that we have. The net zero policies have led energy-intensive manufacturing to move overseas to China and Asia. We're moving the emissions over there. And on the Heritage Foundation website, we have a climate calculator. Shows if we stopped using all fossil fuels today, it would only make a difference of 0.2 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. If Europe stopped using all fossil fuels today, it would only make a difference of 0.1 degree centigrade by the year 2100. We're basically incurring trillions of dollars in costs for no climate gain at all. Meanwhile, people in Russia, China, they want cleaner air too, and they're turning to nuclear power.
I definitely think that there's a huge kind of population push for the cleaner air in China. I think there's another dynamic that's important to point out, which is that China's a huge net energy importer. And if they want to be able to compete with the rest of the world geopolitically, they can't just rely on other countries for their energy needs. And so they're trying to build and control the supply chains of everything from rare earth minerals to more broadly critical minerals, clean energy supply chains, nuclear supply chains. They're trying to just dominate all of them because they realize there's a huge geopolitical benefit to doing that. While we are tying ourselves up with endless red tape and like mandates and the things that are actually holding back entrepreneurship and innovation, they're going full steam ahead because they realize that these are some of the technologies of the future, and that the countries that control them in the same way that the petro states were able to control a lot of the oil and gas supply chains, that's just going to be a huge geopolitical benefit to them. And if we want to truly compete with them from that perspective as well, we ought to be making it easier for ourselves to be innovating and building those things as well.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think China is building more nuclear because they're building more of everything. And they can do that because they own everything and they don't have to go through any regulatory process, and there aren't any environmentalists who are going to sue them because that's not how the system works. Now, we have unnecessarily hamstrung ourselves with an environmental regulatory system that often, frankly, it discourages people from doing things that are good for the environment versus the other way around. We oftentimes make it more difficult to clean up your particulate emissions because once you start modifying your plants, you have to get a whole new permit. Yet we do things like that that make it difficult for us to advance new technologies. The NRC is no exception. But I think you made a great point, Diana, about this sort of idea of offshoring our emissions by offshoring our manufacturing that we've frankly done over the last 2 decades. And it's part of what the dissonance was in the Biden administration when they were, in one hand, saying we really need to focus on bringing back manufacturing capacity and we're going to subsidize it through the tax code. But on the other hand, saying we're going to make it really, really hard for you to build a manufacturing facility of any kind here in the United States. So I think that's what I hope this sort of more energy dominant focused agenda will allow us to acknowledge, that emissions are often involved in manufacturing. And if we do it here, it will be cleaner than it would be if we sent it somewhere else.
And I just add, this is also a really interesting test case of where you see the private sector stepping up. I mean, look what Amazon did on SMRs. They didn't even talk about a power purchase agreement of taking new nuclear on. They said, we're actually going to finance and build the plant. And so there is a strong interest from companies who understand the power needs for and the load growth demand that's coming from AI and data centers, and also wanting to meet their clean energy ambitions and emissions targets. And so I do think this is an opportunity where you see the private sector stepping up to help reduce those green premiums that we're seeing for some of these emerging technologies, because countries are going to build these technologies if it's in their economic self-interest, and the way to do that is if they're cost competitive. And so if we want to deploy these technologies around the country, around the world, they need to be cost competitive. And if the private sector can play an integral role in driving down those green premiums, we're gonna have a better shot at deploying them around the world.
Thanks, y'all. And then I guess one more question, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. But thinking culturally, how do we convince people, explain the very basic truth that we're here today to, I guess, telegraph that free economies are clean economies, that a conservative approach to environmental care is a much better at conservation? Yeah, maybe start with you, Chris. Yeah, this is yours.
We planned that one. That's to stand up. Well, I think the very first thing that needs to happen is we need to establish emotional credibility on the issue. Right now, your average young person will listen to people on this panel, including myself, and will be like, well, I'm not sure if you even care about the issues that I care about. I'm not sure that you want to protect the environment, that you care about the climate, or any of these things that are important to them. And so the very first thing we need to do is, as opposed to say, your ideas are stupid and here's why, we need to define ourselves by what we're for. I want to protect the environment. Like I said, I grew up hiking and fishing and skiing and all those things. I want my children and my grandchildren to be able to do that. That is a deep and very strong passion of mine. And as a conservative, I feel like I have a duty to conserve the world around me for future generations. So let's all agree on the fact that we want to do that, and let's talk about the solutions that will actually work. Then what I typically tell them is like, look, I care so much, I want solutions that actually work. I don't want to make it harder to build nuclear plants. I don't want to make it harder to protect the environment. I actually want to come up with the solutions that truly work because of this first established point, which is that I care. And then all of a sudden they're willing to listen. But I think for so long, the conservative movement has defined itself by what we're against as opposed to what we're for. And it's actually really quite simple. Say why you care and then come up with the solutions that show that you care.
So there's not much to add there, but I would say I think we often see our politicians lead with the clean air, clean water part because that's what they hear from voters. I think we need to be willing to say, here's how it works to make the air cleaner and the water cleaner and to protect the environment in a way and to empower landowners to take care of their own resources. We don't often connect those dots, and I think we need to do a better job of that, particularly in the context of the American Energy Abundance Agenda, where we're saying build more, do more, import, export more. Let's do the math. Let's show people how American natural gas is cleaner. Let's show people how empowering landowners allows farmers to better cultivate the soil and to take care of their water and to not be hamstrung by somebody in Washington telling them whether or not they can actually get water on their property. Let's make it personal. And I think we often like to think of things in the macro and we don't make it personal, which is where we lose the average person who doesn't rank the environment as their top issue.
Well, I think here in Washington we're somewhat in a bubble. So if we look at
No
the
way.
rest of the United States, we look at the rest of the United States, and people are asked how much they're willing to pay for climate change. They're willing to pay very little. This is an elite problem, like defunding the police, as Rob Henderson has written. And most people, they care about inflation. They care about paying their bills. They care about utilities. My son in Connecticut cares about whether he can import stuff to make the bicycle wheels that he then exports to these Olympic teams. They don't talk about politics. They just want to live their lives. And in this last election, we won. We got the trifecta. Now we can roll back all these kinds of regulations that have been harming people who really don't care about it. And the problem is a little bit worse, I think, in Europe, where there's this ideology. They cannot just roll back net zero through regulations because those are laws imposed by the EU, by the way, that they don't even have a say about. That you can see in Europe, the parties that are more right-wing that are trying to roll back these net zero rules, they are winning, they are getting ahead. So basically, I don't think we have to convince people. We have to get changes through our government put in by the elites, and that's why your job is just so important. We're here on Capitol Hill. We're so important that we need to do what people have voted us in to do. It's not like we need to change their minds. We just need to change all these regulations and laws that have become embedded in the system that people just really don't want.
That's good. There.
Yeah, so there's questions in the audience. Here. There should be a mic coming. So if you want to move.
Further question.
Yeah, right here. Thanks.
So I'm Mike Woosley. I'm a nuclear policy fellow, and I sit in Senator Coon's office from Delaware. And so I want to ask a question about renewables for the panel to comment on. When I look at renewables, there seems to be almost like an ineluctable proclivity to lunge at the least marginal cost power source, and that's often wind and especially solar. And when you get above about 20% renewables, there's like a very real intangible cost I think people don't appreciate. We're just like, let's just solve it with a battery. And we've got case studies. I think California spent like a 9-figure balance this year just pushing afternoon power off to their neighboring states because they couldn't throw it away. And so I was just curious, like, the issue I have, and I struggle with this issue, is I don't think the RTOs or the ISOs, which operate our transmission system, have developed strong mechanisms to deal with this problem. And it's in pricing. And it's really tempting to go, we'll just set the market price based on availability. But they don't have pricing mechanisms to deal with the variability. And ERCOT, which is Texas, is patient zero. I think they have one of the worst systems. And so I don't know if anyone in the panel has any thoughts about how you solve this problem of pricing for power and variability.
Well, if you look at the 10 most expensive states in terms of residential electricity prices, they all require renewables. They have renewable portfolio standards. They all have RTOs or ISOs with one exception. and I'll give a bonus point to anyone who knows the one exception. The bottom 10 states, they don't have RTOs or ISOs. They don't require renewables. And we have an electricity price range ranging from 11 cents per kilowatt hour in Utah and Louisiana up to 32 cents per kilowatt hour in the lower 48 in California. So it's clear what's causing these high electricity prices, and wind and solar, they're free, but connecting them to the grid is expensive. That's why the North America Reliability Council has warned about blackouts in the middle of the country this summer because we're layering on this free wind and solar, but there's no baseload power to back it up. This is a very, very serious problem that we need to be dealing with, and we hope that FERC is dealing with that now. But that's one reason we need to roll back these subsidies for wind and solar, because it's not cost effective to have a natural gas power plant to come and just operate for a few hours of the day when the wind stops blowing. And this is something we need to deal with. It's an excellent question.
Yeah, I would just add, one, I think it's important that we talk about the all-in costs, and part of that is the variability, but also part of it is the cost of the tax credit, and part of it is the cost of the backup generation. Part of it is the cost of building any necessary transmission lines to connect it to the grid. And so that doesn't fully address the variability question. And obviously there are areas where when renewables are most prolific, it's when energy and electricity demand is the lowest, and we've seen that in a number of states and regions. I do think, as Chris Wright said at the RPE Summit, getting battery technology better so we account for the necessary storage to account for that variability can fill the gap as battery technologies continue to develop. But from a policy standpoint, I really think it's impactful to think about those all-in costs of the subsidies, of the transmission, and of accounting for variability.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think you're completely right about the all-in cost, and we often use a spot price to sort of cook the books on renewables. But I'd also say there is a huge disparity between the amount of renewables we have deployed in this country and the amount of battery supply that we have deployed in this country. It's like a 300 to 30 ratio, and that's not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And that's because, frankly, we heavily subsidize wind and solar, and batteries have just been kind of hopping along on the end. So it's a really backward system, and I don't think you can fix it in the current environment.
Just to quickly add as well, I think part of the position we put ourselves in as people who believe in free economies is that you never know the innovations that will come out of free economies, right? And to Nick's point about battery storage, if there's an exciting company called Form Energy that in West Virginia right now is building a new type of battery that could be grid scale and is made out of iron, which is 10 times cheaper than lithium and much more available, like that could potentially be a breakthrough in terms of leveling some of the reliability concerns with renewables. What we need to be able to do is build those, and B, mine for the materials that we need. Both of those things are very difficult to do right now. So I think there are policy things that we can be doing to help make that innovation easier and faster, while understanding that countries that have gotten rid of baseload, or states that have gotten rid of baseload, whether it's nuclear or natural gas, and over-relied on wind and solar, that does harm your grid and spikes prices. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed about that while trying to incentivize the continued innovation that could potentially balance some of those things. And I'll just add, there's actually more wind and solar right now that is waiting in interconnection queues than there is on the grid, because we don't have the capacity to either send it from A to B through transmission lines or to store it. So that is clearly a huge problem. Chris Wright has talked a lot about the importance of more transmission lines to be able to better balance supply and demand of energy in this country. I think there's things that we can be doing there, but it is a very real problem.
We also need to be aware that wind and solar are always going to be more expensive than natural gas. It's as though, Nick, I said, I'm going to give you a car. I'm going to give you a beautiful Mercedes, but you can only drive it during the day. I could stop there, but if I have to say there's a string attached, you can only drive it during the day. And you might say, Diana, but I need to drive at night. I mean, I go out in the evening too. Sometimes I get home from work and it's dark. I said, too bad, Nick, you need another car for that. And you say, but 2 cars, that means 2 sets of oil changes, 2 sets of transmission checks, 2 sets of maintenance, 2 cars I have to fill up with gas or charge up. And I say, well, too bad, that's the way it is. It's exactly the same with intermittent energy. With wind and solar, you always need a backup. And that backup is not used all the time, so it's more expensive to put in place. There's fewer incentives. And in the United States, where we are fortunate to have plentiful natural gas, which is clean, we also have coal, which is also clean with our scrubbers and our technology. It's always less expensive to have one system running continuously than two systems in parallel, like two cars, switching on and off when the other one doesn't work.
Thank you all. I think we are waiting for Congressman Arrington to get here, and so we're just going to go ahead and keep doing some Q&A. If there are more audience questions, I've got a long list because I love these folks. Yeah, Simon. Wait for the mic, please.
Hey, Simon Gady at CSIS. Electricity demand from AI, huge, challenging for many states. Does this meet, how does Congress think about electricity policy? You mentioned markets versus sort of integrated utilities, transmission, access to the grid. These are all sort of wrapped up in electricity policy. Should Congress think about this, or is this mostly a state policy issue?
I mean, I think this is mostly a permitting issue. I think we often think of our first jump on all of these energy issues is how can Congress help pay for this problem? And oftentimes, Congress created the problem that made it expensive in the first place, and we should fix that first. And I think that, to me, particularly when it comes to the AI-driven energy growth, is the first thing Congress can do, is let us remove the legislative barriers that we have put in place, frankly, 40 years ago, long before Chris was born, before I was born, that are no longer relevant in today's society and don't work the way we intended them to. So I think before Congress does anything to think about how we muddle with our very complicated electric grid system, which is managed by states and local entities and regional entities and FERC and has all of these different layers, and there's plenty to fix there. We should fix the things that are clearly in our jurisdiction, which are NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, and in some cases the Federal Power Act, that limit our ability to build things in this country and will limit the folks trying to compete with China as they look to build power both on and off the grid.
We have plenty of energy, and we need to be able to use it for everyone. What we don't want to fall into is a trap where these AI companies and these data center companies build plants just for them, because then we're going to have the haves and the have-nots, like the houses with backup generators and the houses without backup generators. We need to make sure that we have a regulatory system that provides everybody, data centers included, with inexpensive energy. We have unlimited natural gas, and you should be using that.
And just to that point, I think of it as both a federal and a state issue for getting the policy right. And to Diana's point, I think it needs to be a ratepayer and consumer protection first. If we have this huge load growth and this huge demand, we don't want the power demands driven by AI and these big companies. If that increases prices, being passed on to the ratepayers in which they're not deriving the benefit. So we need to make sure that, yes, we are making sure that the ratepayers are protected in ways that they are not footing the bill for the power needs of the data centers and of these companies, but they're actually benefiting from it through more consumer choice, more power.
Just to quickly add, the NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, right? So I just don't see any way in which we can get around the fact that you need Congress to act on something like that. I will also add, I don't think that it's bad for example, a data center or a tech company to have their own small modular reactor that powers that data center, right? Even if it's not connected to the grid. I don't think that that's actually a bad thing. And I think actually there could be a world in which companies like Amazon are bringing down the cost curve of some of these SMRs, like the ones that we want to bring onto the grid, because they're currently not necessarily proven technologies, and you need to start building them to bring down that cost curve. If you have a bunch of data centers and tech companies that are able to do that and bring it down, I think that could actually be something that's good for ratepayers in the long term, because then we can start building more of them for the grid as well. So that's just one thought I had.
Yeah, and one addition there too, I think that's actually a place where the federal government could have a role in facilitating that. For example, if you're at a Department of Energy National Lab, there's a bill that I worked on back when I was at the Science Committee, when Nick was at Heritage, and that allows the DOE to license reactors in a way faster process than you can off of a DOE site. that could be an opportunity for co-locating reactor development that could enable data centers to be built much faster using reliable power. So there are lots of tools that you have at your disposal at the Department of Energy when you come to those partnerships with national labs, and I hope that's something they explore.
Thanks, Emily. And I think just to reiterate the point that you said earlier, that most of the time Congress created these problems that it is now trying to solve with money. And so we end up just paying way
Just
more.
throw money at the problem. That's almost always our solution, and it never works. And it doesn't work because we didn't solve the root cause.
Right, absolutely. And we've picked winners, and that's not always gone the best for us.
We're terrible at picking.
We are very terrible at picking winners. But yeah, are there more questions from the audience? Yes, there.
Hi, thank you. Great panel and congratulations on the report. So I have a question. I've worked on permitting, Mario Loyola Heritage Foundation. I've worked on permitting reform for many years, and in the time that last couple of years, I've really spent some time thinking about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies on the power market in the United States. I've come to the conclusion that even if I got my entire wish list of permitting reforms, Danish-style one-stop-shop permitting agencies, 6 months of, I could just, the dream lives on. It still wouldn't fix the problems that we're having right now because the renewable subsidies are ruining the economics of investment in the baseload generation that we actually need. And so my question is, we had a letter, I wrote something about this that might be coming out soon. 20 Republican congressmen wrote a letter to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, saying, oh, it would be very disruptive to end these Inflation Reduction Act subsidies. And I read the letter and I found it mildly horrifying, really, because what is causing the disruption in the power sector is those subsidies. And what can we do to help those congressmen understand that before they take a vote that they're going to regret?
You want me to take
Go
this
for
one?
it.
All right.
Nominated.
So I've talked about this letter and its precursor last Congress many times. I always point to the fact that they didn't name a single specific subsidy in either letter, and that's because all 20 of them can't agree on which one they want to protect. I think I would say I think all IRA policies are not created equal. I think there are plenty of things in the IRA that I dislike and would like to see repealed. There are plenty of things that were picked up from other policies, like I think about 45Q, for example. I would put 45Z in a slightly different category than some of the more power market focused subsidies. And I think, frankly, those are the things most of the people on that letter are talking about. When it comes to, I won't vote to repeal X, Y, or Z, it's the nuclear credit, it's 45Z, and it's 45Q. There's a little bit on the clean fuels credit and or the clean power production credit and things like that. But I think most of those members are more focused on those localized issues that are being driven, particularly by farmers in the 45Z space, and that are focused more on the fuel side. I highly doubt, and I don't want to speak for every one of these members, but they're all people that I know. I highly doubt that any single one of them would vote to allow the TCJA tax cuts for individuals and for small businesses to expire in order to save the IRA. And I think that's a fundamental political truth. So I often caution, I think you're coming at it from one perspective. I talk to a lot of people who come at it from the we gotta save the IRA perspective. And I tell them, I don't think this letter is indicative of a voting pattern that reflects one way or the other.
Yeah, I would add two finer points because Emily said everything perfectly. One is, when they get these tax credits, they still go on for, 10 years. As long as they commence construction, they're probably going to have these. And so, yes, if we can cut off the subsidies for before they start construction, I think that's a reasonable case to make that, yes, the companies who maybe made these investments based on the tax credits and the start of construction are still probably going to get them in some form or fashion. I think a much better approach would be to eliminate subsidies for all energy sources and technologies, but if we don't get there,
Fully support.
but if we don't get there, yes, let's phase out the ones for mature technologies that don't need the subsidies. I mean, there's a lot of cases to be made that these subsidies, whether it's the EV tax credit, are only accruing to wealthy people who are going to buy an EV car anyway. And so the actual emissions reductions you're getting from them, they have huge high abatement costs. And so if we got rid of the subsidies for mature technologies and had something like the energy sector innovation credit that was supposed to phase out after some tech maturation. I think that's a much better way to go that is far less distortive in the market. But even that has risks. I mean, that was how the EV tax credit was initially designed. It was a per manufacturer tax credit that was supposed to phase out as each car manufacturer had increasing sales. And look what we got with the IRA. It was just extended, effectively, potentially in perpetuity if something's not done about it. So even some of those ideas to help emerging technologies can be distortive in the long run.
And just one more thing to add here too. I would say, I used Buddy Carter as an example of, you asked how do I talk to those members about this issue and how it's, price distortive and all of that. Buddy's a great example where he's got an EV battery manufacturing facility in his district that's definitely benefiting from 45X. It's probably benefiting from the EV consumer credit in the long run. But the thing that he's talking about is the fact that the PM 2.5 standards that were going to be set under the Biden administration would have made it impossible to build that factory. So I think we bring it back again to this, no matter how much money we throw at the problem, we cannot solve it if we have a regulatory process that stops us from producing things in America. And that's the truth. And that's where I think our starting point should be.
Exactly. 80% of the EV tax credits go to people in the top fifth of the income distribution. And this EV factory and the battery factories, if we take away the mandate to buy EVs, they're going to be white elephants anyway.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. I'd like to move back to Drew Bond for our closing.
All right, so I'm here to do a song and dance. Regrettably, Jody has a meeting with one of the cabinet secretaries that has gone incredibly late. There's a chance that he might stop by because they have the Republican conference meeting in this building on the second floor. So we've asked for him to at least make an appearance, but no promises. So if you would like, we'd love you to hang around and have some more coffee and have some more breakfast. And if he doesn't show up, then we owe you all a happy hour. How about and I'm curious though, because I won't, if I may ask a question. You guys have, if I can beg your patience for 1 second. As you know, I have a solar company, and so we often talk about being all the above and below. But I know that sometimes we conservatives can come off as being anti-renewables. Because we've been pushing, because there's been such headwinds against fossil fuels, there's been such headwinds against everything other than renewables. And so I often say as a CEO of the solar company, I love solar, but it's not perfect everywhere all the time for everyone, right? It's great when the sun's shining, it's not when it's not. A lot of it is made in China, but not all of it. We have manufacturers here in the US. And some Korean manufacturer Hanwha Q-Cells has invested more than $3 billion in the state of Georgia to build solar panels. So obviously, part of the challenge has been if we had gone faster on renewables, we would have gone further reliant on China for the manufacturing and supply chains, which doesn't make sense. So while I'm very much pro renewables, I'm pro supply chain secure renewables. And that means either making them here in the United States or making them with our friends in Korea or making them in other allied countries. So I guess last thing I'll say on that, and then I just love any comment. I met with two people, one a farmer in Colorado that has 50 center pivot irrigation systems, right? And our product was perfect where if you've seen the big green circles, you've flown over them, there's some brown corners that aren't watered, that aren't farmed. And if those are electrically driven, those are perfect for solar. You can put a small solar array on the corner. It'll actually run your sprinkler system during the day, and then you use the grid as the backup when the sun isn't shining. The other example I think of is this guy out in Nevada that I went and met with. And he was wearing a Trump bandana. He's a Vietnam vet. He had a diesel truck in his driveway next to his Chevy Bolt. He had solar on his roof and now solar next to his house. He wasn't doing it to save the environment, to be honest. He was doing it because he wanted grid reliability and he was looking to save money. And so, I think there's unique situations like that where, again, solar and other technologies can make a lot of sense I remember the days when Boone Pickens was alive. I mean, Boone Pickens was one of the greatest kind of advocates for wind. He was the reason, really, why Texas became such a huge wind state. So I guess I just wonder, like, any thoughts on this kind of challenging trade-off, area where, again, I think you can be pro renewables and pro fossil fuels and pro nuclear and pro like all the above and below. But I think we just, back to Nick's point, we want to think about the trade-offs. Is that fair?
I think I'll go ahead and just start and say that's absolutely fair. That sort of the left has given us a single track narrative that we can only solve climate change through their methods. And they've tried to dominate the narrative, but we are now trying to like flip the script and say no, like all of the above and below is good for the environment and good for our economies. And I think you're like spot on through them.
So T. Boone Pickens was in favor of wind because he, of course, sold natural gas. So he wanted to sell the natural gas backup plants. So that was good business for him. So the question is, do your solar arrays make electricity more expensive for people in the state or less expensive? And can you manage without the subsidies? Those are the two questions that one needs to answer.
Yeah, and those are perfect questions. And one, where, as you know, we are in favor of doing away with all subsidies, as has been noted, and ultimately what is best for the consumer, what is most reliable. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Please stay, mint, and mingle, eat, and then are we allowed to stay for the room, or are they going to kick us out?
Yeah,
Ish.
maybe out by 10.
All right. So there's a chance that our celebrity might drop by. But as I said, I think at this point we owe you a good happy hour. So please join us next time at the happy hour. And thank you so much for coming.